All right, so welcome to the March 9th session of our class. If we're disconnected for more than 10 minutes or so, please check a little bit later on Canvas site for the information that we would have covered. So this is now time for our attendance check-in. I see some of you are really eager to start that process. At this time, please type present for your attendance in chat. If you did not sign in with your full name, be sure to include it in the message. I'll try to remember a little bit later to make this same announcement so that those who join us a little bit later can also check in. Okay, so what we normally do at this point in class, we sort of do a review of the last items that we covered in the course. This is the start of a new unit, so we've just completed a unit. And so what that normally means now is we sort of do a quick review of the test, looking at some items that may have been somewhat problematical to you and things of that nature. So let's go ahead and look at this. So our last unit exam, which was test number 2, I want to go over with you real quickly here some of the test specific items here, as well as some of the characteristics of the test and your performance in this test. All right, so the average score was a 91. And that is still an A. We saw a little bit of a dip in performance from the last exam, which I think your average for this class was a 95. The standard deviation was a 2.78 points, or around 3 points or so was the standard or average deviation from scores. The test time here as well was 41 minutes and 9 seconds. So again, we saw a little bit of a dip in performance, and I think it also an increase in the average time to take the test. I think last time, by the time I did the analysis, there were 20 people who took the test. Here we have 18 students looking at the data at this time. So what we did last time is we looked to see if there were any items that needed some clarification. Last exam, there weren't any. We do have a few today that we want to go over just to make sure that you understand the concept. So just to remind ourselves, what I mean by items for clarification, that means that items not answered correctly at a lower than 70% accuracy, those are the ones that I want to focus on a little bit. And so that's what we have here. The items that were not answered correctly by a majority of you. So accuracy was at 70% or less or fewer were able to get those items accurate. So the first item we want to talk about real quickly here is aggression. Now, there was an item on aggression that met these characteristics, the criteria here. And aggression is about intentionally, and I want to focus on that word intentionally. Aggression is about intentionally harming someone through physical or verbal behavior, including bullying posts being posted on social media, for example. If unintentional, someone harmed somebody, but it was unintentional, then we may be having an accident or something of that nature, an accident. So it's not necessarily going to be deemed as aggression. So aggression is about intentionally harming someone through physical or verbal behavior. So that's one item that I want to make sure that we were clear on to some extent. The other one dealt with homosexual orientation. Homosexual orientation is usually going to be associated with a particular sex hormone. If any sex hormone, it's usually going to be associated with testosterone. And again, men as a percentage of the population are slightly more likely to be homosexual compared to women. But the percentages are very, very small regardless. And so it's only going to be a slight advantage, if you want to refer to it as that way, a slight lead that men have on a greater likelihood of being homosexual compared to women in the population. Now, research also shows that programs designed to try to change a person's sexual orientation are unlikely to be successful. In fact, some have deemed them to be somewhat harmful, in fact. So when it comes to sexual orientation, the idea is there's very little difference between men and women and the population as a whole. The numbers are rather small, but men seem to be slightly more probable of being homosexual than females. But when it comes to changing sexual orientation, the programs that have been presented out there do not work. They're not successful in trying to accomplish a switch in someone's orientation. And then finally, we have infantile amnesia. Infantile amnesia occurs because parts of the brain involved in personal memory, also referred to as episodic memory, and we'll talk more about that in a future chapter, in this particular unit actually. The parts of the brain are not fully developed yet that are related to our personal memory, our episodic memory. They're not fully formed yet. And this includes the structures that we've talked about before, the hippocampus, as well as frontal lobes. So this is one of the reasons that we have infantile amnesia. Just to remind you, when you are growing up and you are 5 years old, things before you're 5 years old, it's very unlikely for you to be able to recall specific instances or situations that may have happened there. If you do recall something that happened when you were 2 years old, most likely what is going on is that you've heard a story told about yourself so often that you've created a memory, a false memory about that particular event. But the reality of it is that we do suffer from this infantile amnesia. When things happen in our life and it's too early in our life, we do not have the equipment and the software yet, so to speak, in order to form those into episodic memories. Now, this type of amnesia is not due to some sort of traumatic event. This form of amnesia is not due to any type of traumas. It's simply because we are not prepared yet mentally with regard to our brain systems to fully take advantage of episodic memory at this time. I'm going to pause real quickly to see if there are any items or any questions or clarifications you wanted about test number 2. You can send me a chat. If not, you can email me later. I'll just wait for a few more seconds here. All right, so I just want to make sure that we went over those particular items that were somewhat of a problem when it comes to our accuracy level on this last test. But overall, a good job, slight dip in performance, but overall a really good job. So thanks for that. So today we begin our unit 3, which will focus on sensation and perception, learning, and memory. All right, so today and this week, we're going to be looking at sensation and perception, chapter 6. So what we'll sense and perceive in this chapter? Sense, especially vision and hearing. We'll focus on those. We'll also examine smell, taste, touch, pain, and awareness of body position. That's a sense we don't hear that much about. How do the sense organs and nervous system handle incoming sensory information? How does the brain turn sensory information into perceptions? Why is our style of creating perceptions better at perceiving the real world than at decoding tricky optical illusions? And we'll be looking at a few of those optical illusions as we go through this material. So let's start off with the basic principles of sensation and perception. Your brain will interpret, perceive these topics as they enter your sense organs: sensation versus perception, bottom up versus top down processing, transduction and thresholds, sensory adaptation, perceptual sets, context effects on perception, and emotion and motivation effects on perception as well. So let's start off with a conversation about sensation and perception. First, let's go over sort of the long definition of what these two things are. And by the way, remember that we talked about this stuff briefly already at the beginning of this course. I used sensation and perception as part of the orientation on the first day in week of class. So sensation. Sensation is the process by which our sensory receptors and nervous system receive and represent stimulus energies from our environment. So there are things out in the environment that we need to know about. And the first step of knowing about those things in our environment is to be able to sense them, utilizing our sensory receptors in our nervous system to get the information of the stimuli out in the environment into us in some fashion or form. Then we have the process of perception. Perception is the process of organizing and interpreting that sensory information that we got through sensation. So the process of organizing and interpreting sensory information, enabling us to recognize meaningful objects and events. So we want to sense something out in the environment, perceive and understand what it is, and then ultimately we want to be able to do something about it. So we want to sense, perceive, and then have the appropriate response. But that appropriate response depends on us first sensing it and then perceiving it or understanding it. Now let's look at a slightly simpler definition of these two ideas here. So when it comes to sensation, the brain receives input from the sensory organs. That's what it comes down to. The brain receives input from the sensory organs. When it comes to perception, the brain makes sense out of the input from the sensory organs. So sensing is getting the information from the sensory organs going to the brain, and then the brain making sense out of the input from the sensory organs is perception. So again, we look at the more detailed definition and the simpler definitions underneath for sensation and perception. Now, another key item to this question of sensation and perception is how do we go about accomplishing this? So let's look at top-down versus bottom-up processing and the idea of transduction to talk a little bit more about sensing and perceiving. So one of the goals that we are trying to accomplish every second of our life as you're sitting at your computer today or at your phone watching this is to try to understand the world around us, to make sense of that world around us so that we can process the information properly and then make the appropriate decisions or actions. So we start off by doing this. There's bottom-up processing. Now, bottom-up processing is taking sensory information and then assembling and integrating it. So what am I seeing? So you're looking at something, you ask yourself, what am I seeing? You take in the sensory information and then assemble it and integrate it until you determine what you are seeing. Top-down processing, using models and ideas and expectations to interpret sensory information. Is this something I've seen before? So with bottom-up, you're taking the basic elements of whatever you are seeing to try to build up the picture of what you're seeing. With top down, you're trying to say, is this something I've seen before based on models, ideas, or expectations? So let's go over to see some examples of this top down and bottom up. So let's look at bottom-up processing. So bottom-up processing is sensory analysis that begins at the entry level with information flowing from the sensory receptors to the brain. All right, I've just included an image to the left underneath this arrow. You look at that image. What is this? Your eyes detect the features, your brain pieces it together, and you perceive a picture of whatever this item is. What you see is based only on the sensory information coming in. So that is how bottom-up processing works. Now let's compare it to top-down processing. And top-down processing is information processing guided by high-level mental processes. That's when we construct perceptions by filtering information through our experience and expectations. So we have loads of experience now. Okay, you've been around the world for almost 20 years, if not more so for some of you. And you have all that experience, okay, that will help you to determine what it is that you're seeing in front of you. So now let me give you the same item, but now with a little bit more information. So we now have the same image that I showed to you earlier in the bottom up processing. Now we're looking at the top down processing. But now we have some more information. Now what is it? Well, surrounded by sequential letters, your brain expects the shape to be a letter B. So now we have A, B, and C. Surrounded by numbers, the same shape now looks like the number 13, 12, 13, 14. So in this instance, what we see with top-down processing, context drives your perception. It drives your perception. So if I showed you a bunch of numbers and then showed you that image, you'd probably say 13. If I showed you a bunch of letters and then showed you that image, you'd probably say B. The context, the things surrounding the item that you're going to try to perceive will have some influence on your perception. Now let's try it another way. So now we're looking at a jar with some graphic on it. Can anybody give me an idea or a shout out as to what you see in front of you? You can type it in if you want, or you can speak it up. I got no problem with it. What do you see in front of you? This is top-down processing. Okay, what I mean by, go ahead.
An intimate couple.
All right, we see an intimate couple. Does anybody see anything else? And I love the phrasing there, intimate couple. All right, so what we see here, well, let me ask you this. We could have a bunch of people there having some issue with their perceptions. Does anyone see an intimate couple? You can say yay or nay on chat. Just one person? Two? All right, there we go. So you guys are speaking up, a bunch of bashful people out there. Okay, now let me explain to you what you did not see. Let me ask now, does anybody see anything other than an intimate couple? Oh, bunch of jaded people out there. Okay. All right. Let's move on and let me show you what you failed to see. Now, what does all this have to do with top-down processing? You utilize experience and expectations to see things, to perceive things. Now, those of you who only saw the intimate couple, okay, that means that based on your experience and expectations, that's what you saw. But if we ask maybe a 5-year-old kid to say what they saw, they probably say they saw what I have circled here. And what do I have circled here? Does anybody notice what it is yet?
Dolphins.
Thank you very much. A bunch of dolphins. So for them, they see dolphins, you know, and we see, excuse the terminology, a couple of naked people. But the idea here is all about experience and expectations. That's what drives your perception. So again, it's very similar to what I described to you during the orientation to the course. I would tell you guys that I could, on my first day of class, normally I'd pass out a little brief short story to half the class. They would get a short story about a nursing home. The other half of the class, I got a short story about pest control. And then I showed them that image that could either be an old man or a mouse. And I could predict who would see what based on what half the class got what story. All right, so their recent experience and expectations had them primed, so to speak, to see the old man or to see the mouse. So in a similar fashion here, our perceptions are going to be driven by our experience, our expectations, and that's really what top-down processing is all about. Now, this is very difficult to see. All right, but this is also top-down processing. So top-down processing, you may start to see something in this picture if you give your brain some concepts to apply. For example, I could say tree, sidewalk, dog, Dalmatian. Does anybody see anything that reminds them of any of those concepts so far?
No.
Does anybody see a dog? A Dalmatian? Oh man, I have to get my tools out here then. Let's see if I can go to the next one here. All right, so this is the head of the dog, the legs. See it so far? Tail. He's a Dalmatian, which means he's black and white in spots. So it's made so that you can't really clearly see it. But this is what you're seeing. Tree. Now, normally, given time, people will be able to pick up on some of these things. The Dalmatian, leaning over, looking at something on the ground, and the tree. So the idea is that what we're seeing here is that we utilize a lot of information to be able to perceive things in our environment. Okay, let's get back. Close that out. Move on. All right. So now we've talked about the basic ideas of top-down, bottom-up processing. Top-down, I think, is a little bit more fun based on our education, our experiences, the things that we expect. That determines what it is that we're going to see. So now let's talk about this next important item here. And this is how do we get from our sensory organs detecting something in the environment to our brain perceiving something. First, we start off with reception. The stimulation of sensory receptor cells by energy. It can be sound, light, heat, etc. Some sort of stimulus out in the environment, out in the world. And we have the sensory receptor cells in order to detect them. All right, so we receive them. Once we go to those specialized sensory receptor cells, then the process, a very important process of transduction occurs. Transduction is this. Let me give you an example. When we hear sound, okay? The waves of sound are changes in air pressure in the air. All right. And so these sound waves go into our ear canal, and move the eardrum and all this type of stuff. That's a very mechanical type of thing. The sound waves moving the vibrations of the eardrum, moving the hammers in the ear. So there's a whole thing there. But how in the world does that turn into us hearing something? All right. The key thing is whether it's light for our eyes and our specialized receptor cells there, or our specialized receptor cells in our ears, we have to transform light energy and sound energy, or whatever energy is out there. We have to transform this cell stimulation into neural impulses. Remember, neural impulses is the language of the brain. So we have to transduce it, taking it from one form of energy, whatever the stimuli is out in the world, and turn it into neural impulses so our brain can actually use it. So we receive it, the stimulation of sensory receptor cells, by the energy out in the environment. We then transduce it, turn it into something that we can use, and then we must transmit it or deliver it, this neural information, to the brain to be processed. Those are the steps. Receive it from the sensory receptor cells, transduce it so we have neural impulses that we can actually use, and then transmit those neural impulses, usually through the thalamus, to the appropriate areas of the cortex so it can be processed. And we can see what it is that we just looked at. We can hear and understand what was just said to us. Okay, those are what we're talking about here: receiving, transducing, and then transmitting or delivering the information where it can be processed. So that is a very important process that we're talking about here. The information, the sensory receptor cells must help us to get the information, and then it must be transduced, turned into something, neural impulses, that we can actually use. Now let's talk a little bit about thresholds and subliminal detection. Thresholds. First, let's start off with an absolute threshold. The absolute threshold is the minimum level of stimulus intensity needed to detect a stimulus half the time. And as you'll get used to, when you hear anything dealing with a threshold, half the time is important, because what they're saying is that half the time you'll detect that something is there, and then half the time you will not be able to detect there's something is there. And that's how they determine the absolute threshold. Okay, half the time you say there's something there, and half the time you don't. So if we can look at the gentle curve we have in the graph below here, we have the intensity of the stimulus at the bottom, and to the side we have the percentage of correct detections. And so at that 50% point, that represents the absolute threshold. The absolute threshold, meaning that we can detect that there's something there 50% of the time, and 50% of the time we don't. Let's look at a few examples of what we mean by absolute thresholds. Here are some examples of absolute thresholds. For vision, a single candle flame from 30 miles on a clear night, half the time you'll be able to detect that it is there. Hearing, the tick of a watch from 20 feet in total quiet. Smell, one drop of perfume in a 6-room apartment. Touch, the wing of a bee on the cheek dropped from 1 centimeter. Taste, 1 teaspoon of sugar in 2 gallons of water. So that gives you an idea of what we mean by absolute threshold. So for each one of these, that means 50% of the time people are able to detect that single candle flame 30 miles away on a clear night, and half the time they are not. That's how they determine that absolute threshold. Now, looking again at the graph we have to the left, we have this shaded area underneath that says subliminal stimuli. And basically it says anything below this threshold is considered subliminal. Subliminal meaning that we have no real awareness of it. It's beneath our threshold. So we never were able to detect that there was something there. It is subliminal to us, below our absolute threshold. Now, when an absolute thresholds are not absolute, I have a couple of slides here on this notion of signal detection theory. Now, signal detection theory refers to whether or not we detect a stimulus, especially amidst the background noise. So we have something which is a signal, and then there's a background noise that can sort of block that signal. All right. So the idea is that with signal detection theory is basically saying your ability to manage that threshold is not absolute. It can change. It depends not just on the intensity of the stimulus, but on psychological factors such as the person's experience, expectations, motivation, and alertness. For example, we have a little picture of a baby here. Parents of newborns can detect a faint baby's cry that others would not stand out from the background noise. So that could be the air conditioner or the heater or the fan going on. And then you have the baby in another room who's crying. People who are not new parents, they may not be able to detect that crying baby sound, but new parents can detect that crying baby sound. Again, that's going to be probably because of their motivations and things of that nature. They're going to be more alert to that particular sound. Therefore, their threshold for it can be adjusted. All right. So that's the basic idea, is that these absolute thresholds are not always going to be absolute. There are other factors that come into play. So let's dive a little bit more deeply into that notion real quickly. So looking a bit more closely at signal detection theory, it predicts how and when we will detect a faint stimulus, a signal, amid background stimulation noise. All right. The signal is what we're interested in. The noise sort of prevents us from hearing the signal too clearly. Individual thresholds vary depending on the strength of the signal and our experience, expectation, motivation, and alertness. Again, this is when absolute thresholds are not absolute. So here's a little table that you can generate here. Now, let's say you have a roommate, and your roommate situation isn't great. You don't particularly like your roommate, but you're having a party and your roommate had to go leave somewhere. He says, I'm expecting a very important package, but you'll have to sign for it. It should be coming. And I apologize, it's going to be coming during the time you're throwing your party. All right, so now you have a party going on in the back of the house. Okay, and then you're trying to listen for a signal, let's say the doorbell. Here are the possible scenarios that can happen. So let's say you think you hear a signal, all right? And then you go to the door and there's no one there. There was no signal there. You thought you heard one. You act like there was a signal, but there was no signal. It was a false alarm. Or you could have the following. You didn't hear a signal, but you're leaving the bathroom and you check by the door and there was no signal. All right, so that was a correct rejection. There's nothing there. No one left a slip of paper or nothing. So the idea here is when it comes to signal or non-signal, there could be a time where the doorbell was wrong, but you did not hear it. So you responded as if there was no signal, but later when you go to the front door, you'll see that little yellow sticky on the door saying, I'm sorry, I missed you. You can pick up your package later at such and such time, or whatever. That was a miss. So the truth of the matter is there was a signal there, but you missed it. Now, what all this is really saying is this. You can have a hit, signal was there, you acted as if there was, great. You have a false alarm that you acted as if the signal was there, but it was not. Or you could have a miss where you act as if the non-signal was there, was not there, and you go to the door and obviously it was because there's that yellow slip of paper. Or you can go to the door a little bit later that there was no signal and there was no yellow sticky, therefore you made a correct rejection earlier. So the idea is that depending on how important it is to you, you're going to put a lot more effort or alertness into it. So if this is your roommate that you really don't like, it really doesn't bother you that much. But what if this is a roommate that you really do care about quite a bit? Then you may be a little bit more alert and a little bit more motivated so that you do not miss the signal. So you may have a lot more false alarms because anytime you thought you heard something, you were there on the spot, okay? Because you don't want to miss it. Now, another scenario too that you may be able to get as well is I did some research years and years ago, and we used this scenario where we had these team of 3 Navy personnel looking at these radar scopes. They were fake radar scopes, and things would be coming toward their ship. And they would have to identify the amount of material required to send a missile up to shoot the target down. Now, using that basic scenario, if you're on a naval vessel somewhere and you're looking for potential threats to your ship, you're going to be very alert and very motivated, and usually going to be a very experienced individual to identify targets to your ship. Therefore, you may probably have a lot more false alarms, but you're going to be highly motivated. So your absolute threshold may not be as absolute. That's all this is trying to say, is that there are going to be other factors that will play into whether or not you're going to move that absolute threshold line back or forth, depending on other factors like experience, expectation, motivation, and alertness. All right, any questions on that before I move on? Okay. The other item I want to cover is something referred to as the just noticeable difference. So this is yet a different type of threshold, the difference threshold. The minimum difference in color, pitch, weight, temperature, etc., for a person to be able to detect the difference half the time. Again, back to that notion of half the time. Now, Weber generated a law. Weber's law refers to the principle that for 2 stimuli to be perceived as different, they must differ by a minimum percentage. So they've run the numbers and they've come up with the percentages of difference that must be there for you to be able to notice a difference half the time. So when it comes to weight, you need to have a 2% difference of weights before you noticed a difference between the weights. So if you have only a 1% difference between 2 weights, one you have in one hand, the other one you have in another hand, let's say, assume that you're ambidextrous, so just as strong on each hand, may be unusual, but let's say that is for this case, you will not be able to determine that one weight is heavier than another until it gets to that 2% difference. Then 50% of the time you will be able to tell. Then we need 8% difference for light intensity to be seen as different. So the one light needs to be 8% different, okay, or more intense than the other, so you can say, yes, they're different from one another. 0.3% for sound wave frequency to notice a difference in pitch. Now, let me ask you this. Has anybody noticed a slight change in the slide just now? I did it again. I did it again. Has anybody noticed a change in the background color of the slide? Say yeah or nay. Well, some of you may have noticed.
No.
Okay, good. So the idea is that there is a slight change. Let me point my cursor around here to see if you can see the line here, right there. I don't know if it comes across, but there you go. So the idea is that it's a subtle change. All right, in order for you to be able to notice it, it needs to be a certain degree of difference for you to be able to notice the difference in intensity. So the idea here is that with just noticeable differences or different threshold, we have determined certain things that will sort of influence your ability to detect a difference between 2 stimuli. All right, the next topic is one that you may have heard of before, and it is called subliminal. Below our threshold for being able to consciously detect the stimulus. And we referred to it just a few slides ago about subliminal, okay? Okay, so subliminal is something that you are not aware of that is being presented to you. So you're not aware of it consciously, but you may be aware of it, and this is the kicker, you may be aware of it unconsciously. All right, so awareness is in quotes there. So unconsciously, you may detect it, but consciously, you do not detect or are aware of the stimulus. So, although we cannot learn complex knowledge from subliminal stimuli, we can be primed, and this will affect our subsequent choices. We may look longer at a slide of the paper, which had just showed a nude image just for an instant. Okay, so the idea here is that research seems to show that, one, we can sense something without being aware of it. So we can sense something. We know something is there, but we're simply not aware of it. So part of us is aware, again, in quotes, sort of like unconscious, automatic process part of us, but we're not consciously aware of it. Two, we can be briefly primed, but not enduringly influenced by subliminal stimuli. So the idea is, and it's been around for some while, the idea of subliminal messages influencing us, subliminal communication influencing us, and things of that nature. So this is not something that's new, and some of you probably have come across some of the subliminal images that I'll show you in a few seconds here. So again, let's look at this idea of subliminal persuasion, but first let's look at some of the things that build up to it. First, we have, again, subliminal stimuli are those that are too weak to detect 50% of the time. They are below the absolute threshold, so we don't have conscious awareness of them. Then we have subliminal sensation. It exists, but such sensations are too fleeting to enable exploitation with subliminal messages. Now, let me give you an idea of why people were concerned about this. It goes back to, I guess, almost an urban legend now. I'm not quite sure. I've not determined whether or not it was real or not, but you hear it and read about it so many things. I wrote a paper about it years and years ago. It comes down to this. Years ago, they report a movie theater spliced together within the promo reel for their feature film subliminal messages about eating more popcorn, buying more Coke, and all that type of stuff. And they did that so fast that no one in the audience was consciously aware that it had been done, that they were getting messages sent to their brain without their conscious awareness. And the report goes something like this: the amount of sales for Coca-Cola and popcorn shot up. That's the story behind it. And that's the whole idea. If that was something that like that did exist, of course, advertisers, people who wanted to try to persuade you to do things, they'd be in line to develop these types of things in order to accomplish that task. And for a while, we did see advertisers doing certain types of things to do that very idea, to influence you. So subliminal persuasion may produce a fleeting and subtle but not powerful or enduring effect on behavior. So we can see some subtle changes potentially, but they're not really strong and they really don't last. That means they're not enduring on people's behavior. And the research that has been done on this, experiments tend to disprove claims of the effectiveness of subliminal advertising as well as subliminal self-improvement tapes. You know, those subliminal messages that are on MP3 files or tapes or CDs, whatever you have it, that tell you to stop smoking or stop overeating, things of that nature. So the research, when the research is done on those types of things, they don't see and find that their claims of effectiveness are actually there. But again, we do have examples of subliminal advertising and all sorts of things out there, and I'm going to show you a few of them. I want to also communicate this idea too. So subliminal advertising is just that, meaning they're trying to communicate to you at an unconscious level without you being fully aware of what they may be doing. Now, if you're being influenced and not knowing that you're being influenced, that's an ideal scenario for advertisers. Now, the other thing I want to talk about too is subliminal graffiti. And that means somebody is just doing something, putting some sort of image or message somewhere just to mess with an organization. And by the way, one organization that's messed with a lot is Disney. Okay, and so Disney sometimes will have images put in their films or whatever that are not appropriate for the Disney image, so to speak. Let me pause real quickly. Does anybody know what I'm talking about when I say subliminal graffiti, people hiding messages and movies and things of that nature? I'll pause to see. Anyone?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I know when I was in school, this stuff was around, so I'm sure you guys have seen some of this stuff already. So let's look at some of these examples real quickly here. Now, I'll revisit this particular slide a little bit later. Break out the frosty bottle and keep your tonics dry. This is a gin ad from a magazine from years ago, and we'll revisit this a little bit later. But the idea is that they're having a subtle message in there, a subtle message that's trying to communicate to you at a level beneath your level of awareness so that you're not consciously aware of them communicating to you. But they are communicating. We'll show that a little bit later when we get back to it. All right, moving on. This is graffiti. You see a mouth and an object there, which looks very phallic. It's in one of the ice cubes. They blew the image up here to show it. So this is graffiti for a Coke ad. Anybody see what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Okay. The other thing here, this may be classic. Some of you may even own this if you're a little bit older. Anybody ever seen the movie The Little Mermaid? The classic Little Mermaid. All right. Okay. Years ago, when they had VHS tapes, videotapes, they would recalled a bunch of them, but somebody who designed the cover put a phallic symbol in the golden spires and towers here on the cover of The Little Mermaid. So this again is a little bit of what they would call subliminal graffiti. This is not so it's subliminal. It's about the context in the image. So this is an actual ad. I forget what year it was done, but look about what it's saying here. It's almost like the same image that we saw with the Coca-Cola a little bit earlier. Let me just read you some of the things. It just tastes better. It'll blow your mind away. The BK Super 7-incher. So there's all sorts of entendres there, all sorts of images. The idea with subliminal is they get your mind to think about something, but you may not know why you're thinking about it. Butt cheeks. This is too obvious to tell. This is another, I think it's a brand Coca-Cola item or some of that nature, some sort of candies. Again, you see the image there, female leg spread, and then if you look at the computer monitor, you see the rocket ship.
Is this just for shock value in order to sell something?
What it comes down to is this, and we'll see more about this when we get to chapter 7, which is about learning. You've heard of the term sex sells, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And this is why we don't see it as much anymore. Let me move out of this slide here. We don't see it as much anymore. But what they try to do is they try to associate a product and or service with something that people somewhat universally like. And by association, the positive feelings that you have to the one that's naturally positive for you can then become associated with the one that's not. That is why, particularly during the 60s and 70s when they were very blatant about it, anytime you would try to sell a sports car, you would have a scantily clad female model draped on the car. There'd be no reason or rationale behind it, but you wanted the female associated with the car, female associated with the car. And the idea in the minds of people, when you see that car later in the showroom, you associate that car with the female. Does that make any sense?
Yes.
Okay. And so that's what they're really doing here. And that's why you see a lot of this stuff focused with sex or things that may heighten one's relationships. And they want you to think along those lines. The other thing, I guess, really comes down to the graffiti part where they just have anger toward an organization and they want to do something that's totally against their image. And that's why they'll slip images in when they can into films or covers of books and things of that nature. But that's what this is all about. And again, sometimes it's going to be very subtle, sometimes not so. But again, most advertisers are already really good at what they do. If you've ever found yourself humming a tune from a commercial or telling the commercial to a friend, whatever, over and over again, they have succeeded in what they wanted you to do. It's going to be greatly more likely that when you're at the grocery store or the department store, depending on what the product is, and you think of that commercial, they've won, because that's what they want you to do. They want you to think of them again when you have the opportunity to purchase their product or in the market to purchase a product like theirs. That's victory to them. But for the most part, Advertisers are already really good at this. They don't have to rely on this type of trickery, in a sense, in order to do it, because they're really good at doing their commercials these days. All right, moving on. So the next item we talk about is what influences perception. What influences perception? So first we have sensory adaptation. To help detect novelty in our surroundings, our senses tune out a constant stimulus such as a rock in your shoe or the ticking of a clock. Now, we are designed for novel or new information. Once we've been there and done that, and we have this sensory input, and the sensory input is of no further value to us, we tune it out. We can get used to it. We adapt to it. So the rock of the shoe, no longer a big problem. It was for a while, now it's gone. The ticking clock that was annoying you, it's gone now. You've adapted to it, all right? So if you concentrate on keeping your eyes in one spot, you'll see the effects as your eyes start to adjust to stimuli. Visual sensory adaptation will be tested when we discuss the opponent process theory a little bit later, in a few slides from now. But the idea with sensory adaptation, we all experience it. For example, let's say you walk into a room and something was left on the stove, maybe something plastic or whatever. They caught it in time so the place didn't burn down or nothing, but it has a really bad odor. You open some windows, but you really can't stand it. The odor still is there. It's very strong. But after a while, you being in that room, it no longer affects you anymore. You sort of adapted to it. All right. So that's what we tend to want to do. We want novel stimuli, stuff that is new into our environment, because that gives us a lot more information. That's more useful to us. So until something changes, we tend to adapt to what's already there. Now, let's talk about this thing called the perceptual set. A perceptual set is what we expect to see, which influences what we do see. So when you expect to see something, okay, you're more likely to do what? To actually see what you expect to see. So perceptual set is an example, again, of top-down processing. So let's look at a few pictures here. So is this Loch Ness Monster or tree branch? Are these flying saucers or clouds? So to some extent, what you expect to see will help determine what you will see. It's also referred to at sometimes like inattentional blindness, where our attention is one place, and therefore we may be blind to other possibilities of what this thing may be because of that expectations of what we expect to see. Now, this is the old woman, young woman. You've probably seen this before. So we have the old woman there and the young woman, but they're basically the same item, the same graph to some degree, but we've designed it here so that you can more easily see the old woman and more easily see the young woman on the right. If we show the ambiguous version, you can sort of go back and forth between the two. The young woman who's looking away from us, and the old woman whose chin is sort of down, looking right in front of her. So again, if I gave you a story about an old lady or a young lady and then showed you this picture, the ambiguous one, those who have the story about the young lady, you probably see the young lady. The old woman, you probably see the old woman. Okay, you can be primed by what story I give you before I show you the ambiguous image. Now, the context effect on perception. In which picture does the center dot look larger? Perception of size depends on the context. Generally speaking, most people will say the one to the right because of the context in which it appears. It just simply looks larger. Now, if you have a pen or pencil handy, I'm going to give you a really quick test. It's an activity. I'm just going to call it a test. I'm going to state some words. It's a 6-word spelling test. You cannot ask questions. Just take a guess and listen to the next word. Write these words down. Okay, so don't type them in. Just write them down with the pen or pencil, whatever you have. I'm going to I'm going to start in a second here. You can't ask me to repeat anything or ask for any clarification. They're going to be 6 words starting now. Double, pair, apple, pair, payee, pair. Okay, we should be finished now. Let me show you the answers and let me ask you the following questions. Okay, so how many people in the first one actually did write down double and then pair, P-E-A-R? Anyone? Okay. And then when I said,
did.
okay, you did? Okay. So did it mean I write down P-A-I-R? Okay. So we have apple, payor, payee, pair. The idea here is this. We have the ability to sometimes be influenced by things. So example, if you heard double clearly enough, you may have written pair, P-A-I-R. Apple, excuse me, you may have written pair, P-E-A-R. But the idea is that context does matter. This is a different way to get at what we talked about earlier when we looked at top-down processing. With that image that either could be a B or a 13, depending on the context. So the context will have a great deal of impact on your perception. Now, here are some other things that have some impact on your perception as well. So experiments show that destinations seem further when you're tired. So when you're tired, the destination is seen further away. A target looks further when your crossbow is heavier. A hill looks steeper with a heavy backpack or after sad music when walking alone. And something you desire looks closer. So the idea is that your motivation, your physical state, your emotion has some influence on what you actually perceive and how you're going to perceive it. Even your internal states to a degree can be influenced by things in context of your environment. For example, let's say, and this has happened to all of us, I am certain. I don't know how it fits, but it just seems like it should fit to some extent. When you've been on a long trip for a long time and you realize you're getting close to home, and so instead of trying to make a pit stop somewhere, you're going to wait to use the bathroom when you get home. And then you get into your neighborhood, your subdivision, and then you get into your driveway. And all of a sudden, as you're getting closer and closer into your house, the pressure, the feeling that you have to go use the bathroom immediately tends to intensify greatly. Does anybody know what I'm talking about there? Give me a yes if you do. All right, so yeah. Okay, so we've all experienced it, that as soon as you get close, it's like all of a sudden they're turning everything up. It's like you see the relief is just there in the corner, and it's like it can't wait anymore. The pressure is like intensified. Nothing really seriously has changed. It's going to be your perception of things, okay? Your psychology of things to some extent that's really changing. All right, so now let's look at our primary senses. We'll be able to cover some of these before we get out of here today. But looking at our primary senses, we'll be looking at the eye, from light input to mental images, retina and receptors, feature detection, parallel processing, color vision, and we'll see visual organizational stuff a little bit later. We'll probably touch a little bit on some of the Gestalt stuff before we get out of here, and then we'll pick up on the rest later in the week. So let's start off with vision. The most important sense that we have. We don't want to lose our sight. We rely so much on our vision that the idea of losing vision is particularly scary to us. So let's start off by looking at the stimulus. And the stimulus is light. So we encounter waves of electromagnetic radiation. Our eyes respond to some of these waves. Our brain turns these energy wave sensations into colors. So at the upper left, we have this white light going into this prism, which breaks the white light up into its constituent parts. And then we see at the very bottom, we see the wavelengths, all the possible wavelengths down listed there. We have gamma rays, X-rays, ultraviolet rays, infrared rays, radar, broadcast bands, and AC circuits. But in that little middle between ultraviolet and infrared, we have a small sliver. That is the visible spectrum. That small sliver is what we're able to see as human beings. Okay, so these electromagnetic waves, okay, we see them, we make colors to represent them, okay, but that's all that we can see. A very, very small amount of all the possible things that are out there for us to detect. Now, I can imagine if we could see all these types of things, the house that we're at, in your room, you'd probably see all these weird things going on, which would probably be kind of confusing. So right now, all we have is this small part of the visible spectrum of light that humans have access to. Now, let's break this down to look at these waves a little bit more precisely here. So first, we have color or hue in brightness. We perceive the wavelength or frequency of the electromagnetic waves as a color. So here we have a short wavelength or high frequency, and we tend to see those as bluish colors. We have a longer wavelength or low frequency, we tend to see those as reddish colors. So again, it should be noted that this is what is happening in us. When we look at something and we see it as being red, it really is not red. That's just how we perceive the color of that item based on our capabilities. Then we perceive the height and amplitude of these waves as intensity or brightness. So a great amplitude, a really large wave here, is going to be a really bright color. A small amplitude wave is going to be a very dull color. So if we have somebody who has a really bold color, a great amplitude, bright color, then the amplitude is going to be rather large. So those are characteristics of the waves and how it is that we perceive those particular electromagnetic waves. So we have these stimuli out in the environment, and so we need to have things that we have the capability, the sensory receptor cells that have the capability to detect, to receive these electromagnetic waves, this light, and then transduce it into something that we can actually use into that neural impulse. So we start by looking at the structure and the sensory receptors. So vision, the structure, and the sensory receptors. The organ that we always talk about is going to be the eye. All right. So this is the eye, and these are the structures of the eye. So let's walk through this real quickly here. Light from the candle passes through the cornea and the pupil, the hole there, and gets focused and inverted by the lens behind the pupil. The light then lands on the retina at the very back, where it begins the process of transduction into neural impulses to be sent out through the optic nerve. So what we have here is the light going through cornea, pupil, hitting the lens reflected back to the back of the eye where we have the retina. The retina is where we have the specialized sensory receptor cells that will allow us to transduce the light into something that we can use. Now, the lens here is not rigid. It can perform accommodation by changing the shape to focus on near or far objects. And I'm sure this is still going on today, where people may go have some sort of LASIK type surgery that will use a laser to change the lens more permanently to allow them to have better focus on things that are far away, for example. So let's look more closely here at the retina. So we have these white arrows here that represent the light entering the eye. It triggers a photochemical reaction in rods and cones. So here we see the rods and cones down here. All right. The chemical reaction in turn activates bipolar cells. The bipolar cells then activate the ganglion cells, the axons of which, after the ganglion, the axons of which here, the ganglion cells, the axons of which converge to form the optic nerve. Now, the nerve transmits information to the visual cortex by way of the thalamus to the brain. So the light goes in, excites the rods and cones. They send a neural impulse out. The axons of the ganglion cells here come together to form the optic nerve that leave the eye here physically. Please note that when this optic nerve leaves here, there's no retina, no specialized receptor cells at this location. Therefore, this area here does not have the ability to see anything. It does not have the equipment to do so. Therefore, we refer to this area ultimately as the blind spot. So again, we have the optic nerve here, and this is the blind spot. So when information crosses over this item here, it simply disappears because there's no specialized receptor cells there to be able to do anything about processing the information. So there's an area of missing information in your field known as the blind spot. This occurs because the eye has no receptor cells there at the place where the optic nerve leaves the eye. To test this, you can walk slowly. We can't do this now. There is an example in your textbook, I believe on page 202 or figure 6.16. So if we were in a big classroom, and I had this on the big screen, you could walk slowly to the screen with one eye closed and the other eye fixed on the dot. And eventually what would happen as you get closer and closer, one of the phones would simply pass across that blind spot and simply disappear. It just vanish, because once it goes across the blind spot, you have no equipment there to allow you to see, and so it simply disappears. Now, the photoreceptors we mentioned here are the rods and the cones. All right. When light reaches the back of the retina, it triggers a chemical change in two types of receptor cells. Rods help us see the black and white actions in our peripheral view in the dark. Cones help us see sharp, colorful details in bright light. So, for example, when you wake up in the morning, it's still somewhat darkish outside, so it's not a great deal of light. You're waking up, there's enough light in your room, and you can see stuff, but it's going to be shades of gray. There's no color vision there, okay? When you're in a movie theater and they turn the house lights down just before they start the feature, all of a sudden it's like somebody is sucking the color from those big red chairs you sit in the movie theater. Because at one point, the cones had enough light to be able to be active, but then when you take too much light away, they can no longer be active. And then those red chairs become shades of gray because the rods are more active now. So let's look at what the differences are between these cones and rods. So at the very bottom, we see the location, the number, and all those types of things for cones and rods. Cones, there are 6 million cones and 120 million rods in the eye. The cones are primarily going to be located around the fovea, or the center of the eye. The rods are located around the periphery, everything but the center. The cones, sensitivity to dim light, they have low sensitivity to dim light, meaning they don't work in dim light. Whereas the rods, they are very sensitive to dim light. They work best in dim light. Color sensitivity, cones are very sensitive to color, whereas rods are very insensitive to color. Cones have detail sensitivity, meaning they can see a great deal of detail, whereas rods have low detail sensitivity. That's when you try to look at something very detailed oriented and very dim light, you don't see it so well because all you have functioning then are going to be the rods, and they're not sensitive to detail. You turn a light on, hold it in the center of your eye, you'll be able to see it much more clearly, because now with the light, the cones are very sensitive and they can see better, okay? And then they can see detail when there's sufficient light. So cones and rods are different, but they serve different functions. So in dim light, cones are not going to be very effective. In dim light, it's going to be the rod's time to shine, so to speak. So let's look at visual processing and color processing. The rods and cones send messages to the ganglion and bipolar cells on the optic nerve. Once the neural signals enter the optic nerve, they are sent through the thalamus to the visual cortex. So the images we see are not made of light. They are made of neural signals which can be produced even by pressure on the eyeball. So turning neural signals into images. In the visual cortex are neurons called feature detectors. They respond to certain visual aspects of the environment. These cells in turn send information to neural networks or supercell clusters that can perform tasks such as recognizing individual faces, houses, chairs, houses and chairs. So what we see here, there are areas of the brain that seems to be focused primarily on certain recognition factors. So these are designed to do those types of things. The most important, obviously, is going to be faces. So when we have damage to certain areas of the brain, we can see that there could be problems with getting this information integrated properly. So you may be able to see the features, but fail to integrate them into a whole. So we have people who have the disorder that they see fine, but they have no ability to recognize individual faces. Then parallel processing, turning light into mental active seeing. So this is what we see so far. Light waves, chemical reactions that's happening in the retina that then transduce them to neural impulses, which then sends them to ultimately the areas of the brain and the visual cortex for processing, and we're able to determine the objects that we're looking at. And then there's one more step that's going on too here, parallel processing. We saw this idea happen a little bit earlier, building perceptions out of the sensory details processed simultaneously in different areas of the brain. For example, a flying bird is processed as color, motion, form, and depth. It's done unconsciously, so we don't have to do it. It's done automatically for us. So what we see is the following. We start at the very bottom here. We have a scene. We go through retinal processing, receptor rods and cones, bipolar cells, ganglion cells. Then we ultimately go to the brain detector cells to respond to specific edges, features, lines, and angles, feature detection, which then go to parallel processing, where the brain cells teams process combined information about color, movement, form, and depth. And then we get down to recognition. The brain interprets the constructed image based on information from the stored images, and then we see it's a tiger, so run. Then we have color vision. According to this theory, the Young-Helmholtz trichromatic theory, there are three types of color receptor cones, red, green, and blue. All the colors we perceive are created by light waves stimulating combinations of these cones. The color codes describe the color they react to, or the electromagnetic wave frequency they react to, not what they look like. Then we have color blindness. People missing red cones or green cones have trouble differentiating red from green and thus have trouble reading the numbers to the right. So here you can see that if you have color blindness, you will not be able to distinguish that the top number is 45 and the bottom number is 74. Now, dogs have blue and green, but no red cones, so they are dichromatic. Okay, so they're not colorblind, they just don't have the full range that we do. Then we have the opponent process theory. It refers to the neural process of perceiving white as the opposite of perceiving black, similarly yellow versus blue and red versus green in the opponent process. Here's an example. The dot, keep staring at the dot in the center for the next 30 seconds or so. Keep staring at the dot. Give you a few more seconds. when I go to the next slide, there's going to be a white slide for the most part. The dot will still be there, but what you should see is the opponent process color, meaning that while you are looking at this image here, the other opposite number colors are being suppressed. And so when I take this away, the other ones which were being oppressed at the time will have the ability to reveal themselves, and you should see the opposite color reveal itself. Now, tell me if you see it. Anybody see it?
Yes.
Okay, so what that represents is the opposite colors, the opponent process theory or after images at work here. So that demonstrates a little bit of what they say it would happen, and it happened. So there's the evidence for the opponent process. Now, lastly here, let's look at what we can cover for the remainder of the class here, looking at vision, perceptual organization, and gestalt. First, we have perceptual processes for enabling us to organize perceived colors and lines into objects, grouping incomplete parts into gestalt wholes, seeing figures out against the background, perceiving form and depth, keeping a sense of shape, size, and color constancy despite changes in visual information, and using experience to guide visual interpretation, restored vision and sensory restriction, and perceptual adaptation. So let's look real quickly at this first example. All right, so what you have here, our senses take in the blue information on the right. However, our perceptual processes turn this into the following: a white paper with blue circle dots with a cube floating in front. Some of you probably see that now. Or a white paper with blue circle holes through which you can see a cube. Or a cube sticking out of the top left or bottom right. Or blue dots. What cube? There's no cube. With angled lines inside. So the idea here is that we all are seeing possible different things, but none of them really are what we think they are. We're seeing things which are not necessarily there, and we cannot stop seeing them. Here's a few other examples. This is something you're probably familiar with, figure ground. In most visual scenes, we pick out objects and figures standing out against the background. Some art models this ability by giving us two equal choices about what is figure and what is ground or background. Goblet or two faces, stepping man or arrows. Okay, so we see these arrows, but also you see a stepping man, like walking downstairs. Here's some other ideas. Gestalt refers to a meaningful pattern or configuration forming a whole that is more than the sum of its parts. I'm sure you've heard of that before, that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So with Gestalt, they're saying that when we perceive things, it's more than the things that make up what we're seeing. It's just not adding them together. Three of the ways we group visual information into wholes are proximity, continuity, and closure. Proximity meaning that when we see this items together here, we're automatically going to put them into two lines, two lines, two lines. We have no choice but to do that. And then we have continuity. We want to see things as smooth line, continuation. That's the way we're designed. We don't want to see things seen as a half a line, then a line, straight line, and then a hump. No, we want to see them as a continuation. And then the other one I think is even more drastic. We don't even need the outline. We see triangles there. But there are no triangles, but we cannot help seeing those triangles. The triangles do not exist, people. I assure you, the triangles do not exist, but our mind's eye keeps telling us that they are there. So let's go ahead and put them there now. Those triangles don't exist. This is our mind trying to have closure. And so we automatically close those things together, and that's what we have there. It's sort of like an illusion to a degree that we can't escape from. And that takes us to the last thing here. Which ones influence perception here? So we see this stuff here. Okay, we see a dog that seems to be crawling on one of the posts of this little fake house. Things look a little bit off and weird, but the idea really is this. This house is all screwed up. It's not what we think it is. So what makes our perceptual organization skills turn the structure onto the right, an impossible 3D figure? Well, certainly we have closure and continuity are part of what makes the boards look like they continue behind other boards and connect in places they really don't. Even though these connections and closures create an image of a house that violates our sense of how things can work in 3D space. It's one of the reasons why illusions work to fascinate us, because we know, despite the fact that it can't exist that way, that's what we are seeing. That's what our brain is telling us. All right, so that covers what I wanted to cover for today, looking at least the idea of vision as our first primary sense. Are there any questions now for us? All right, if there are no other questions or comments, we can go ahead and start departing now. I'll give you a few minutes to see if there's anything that you need to tell me or ask me. If not, you guys have a great day, great Wednesday, and I will see you on Thursday. Take care.